So, something I'm learning about is how mindfulness practices and inner dialogue practices, such as using internal family systems, work together to help us heal trauma and support ourselves while going through life. And let me just give you some of my personal background here, and then I'll give you this theoretical view of how they fit in, as well as how it's experientially fitting in for me right now. So, the background of this for me is that I have been meditating for about 10 years, and so I'm much more familiar with that style of relating to your emotions. And what I find is that in the past, a lot of the meditation I would do would view emotions as something to be aware of, certainly, and something to locate in the body, but it wouldn't necessarily have anything to do as far as dialoguing with that emotion or connecting with it or actively trying to support it. It would be just more like a kind awareness, certainly, but just this gentle, compassionate awareness. And often I find that the focus, especially in Western mindfulness, which is what I know, I think what may have happened with the transition of mindfulness from the East to the West is that there may have been less of a focus on compassion at first because, people didn't want to seem like too hippy dippy. And so you had things like mindfulness based stress reduction, which is very much awareness and not quite so much a focus on the compassion. So anyways, regardless of how we got there, there does seem to be a shift. And my personal experience is now kind of going from, hey, you're just being aware of these emotions, and it's more of like an awareness thing. Meditation is about sensing and perceiving towards this active compassion. And I'd always done metta practice, which is a form of loving kindness, or it's loving kindness, but it's a form of more of a heart or compassion practice. And that's when you're actively wishing for yourself or others to have, these feelings of joy, of goodwill. You're wishing that they're happy, that they're healthy. You're basically just wanting the best for them and feeling what that feels like to truly want that. And I've always found that really helps me. And so what I'm finding to be the most useful here is this heart-focused meditation practice where there is certainly awareness of the body and everything, but there's a large emphasis on compassion and on support and on giving love to these emotions that come up, rather than just being aware of them. Because what I find for me is when I just try to be aware of them, let's say anxiety, for example, the anxiety then often dominates the scene. It's not like, oh, the anxiety is surrounded by this like loving awareness. It's like my whole body is anxious. And I'm learning from teachers such as Kelly Boys that that's not really what you want. You don't want to flood your nervous system. You want to have this calm presence with the challenging emotions such as anxiety and give it kind of like a back and forth treatment where you're feeling the anxiety and you're letting the anxiety feel this presence. And you're kind of going back and forth, and maybe you alternate, maybe you meld them. In any case, there's a dynamic with both of them there, which I think what it's transforming me from is this idea of just blanket presence or awareness, where you're just watching, into more of an active engagement. Presence isn't just oh, I'm watching from this third point of view, okay, there's that happening. And it's there's almost this detachment. And at least for me, I don't think that's the way that's the most helpful. I think what's more helpful is this active engagement and saying, oh, here's this thing, let me, investigate this and be curious. and just be with it, basically. So that's on the meditation side. Um, but there's something more to healing trauma. Obviously, there's more to it, but I'm finding that there's a couple big areas where you can help heal the trauma. And I think two of these key pillars are the meditation practice, and also what I'm going to call this inner dialogue practice, or this dialogue with your parts. I think there's a third pillar to this, that is physical self-care and things like sleep hygiene and nutrition and movement, and your relationships and things like that, and also your information diet. So I think there's all these other things that basically just support yourself in a lot of different ways biologically and make it easier to heal from trauma. But I think the actual work of healing trauma comes from a combination of more of a therapeutic inner dialogue work and the meditation stuff. If I had to choose one, I'd probably choose the therapeutic, but I feel like they blend together in such a way where, like if you're talking with your anxiety and you're having a dialogue with it, by developing that awareness and calm presence and that love in meditation, then you have such a strong inner resource and environment to have that conversation with the anxious part. And the lesson for me is that, even a part that's anxious, they don't want to speak to another part that's anxious necessarily. They want to be in the presence of someone who's calm and who's grounded. And so it's really viewing this internal environment as having multiple, things going on. And even if there's this idea of like a self that's, innately good and healing, I think that we can strengthen our connection to the self, strengthen the presence of the self. I think it's always there, but I certainly think that meditation does have a really important part to play in this healing process. So on the dialogue part, that's basically, I've heard of this Sufi heart practice. I've heard of, obviously, internal family systems, which is what I've been using. Kelly Boyce talks about some part work in her Yoga Nidra sessions. And it's basically this idea of, dialoguing with these emotions and not just giving them love or awareness, but also like actually talking to them and saying like, hey, like, what's going on? What are you feeling? How can I help? Is there any lessons you have for me? And I think there's different levels to this. Like there's kind of just asking those questions that I just outlined, which I think is very, very helpful. But then, and it might be helpful to buy the IFS book or have a therapist who's trained in IFS work through this with you. But there's this other level of basically doing the internal family systems practice, which, there's a lot of different dynamics to it. There's dynamics in terms of there's parts that are protectors and there are parts that are exiled. And I think it's also just really helpful to get a professional because, at least for me, I had an experience a few days ago where I had this angry part that had been suppressed for a long time. And I basically had let it, I was like, hey, I want to hear from you. And the thing was, it was very good overall to do that. But in that moment, it was very challenging for my nervous system because there was so much emotional energy that it was really challenging. And so I think that it's, especially if you don't have the money to pay for a therapist, doing meditation on your own and doing the physical self-care, biological self-care, we'll call it, I think that's even more crucial because that's going to really tilt the odds in your favor in terms of being able to have a nervous system that is healing but not getting so triggered by the healing, if that makes sense. So I think that all in all, the best way to approach this is to have these really consistent internal practices and also work with a therapist. Um, but yeah, I think for me, what I'm finding is that doing an hour of meditation, maybe not immediately after I wake up, because I feel like I need to like drink some water and stuff. But certainly, no later than an hour after I wake up, and doing a mix of, like calming and supporting and loving, but then switching into dialogue and finding that mixture, maybe like a 50-50 mixture, something like that, is very helpful. Um, and even as I'm saying that, I'm feeling these parts saying like, hey, don't forget about us. Don't like just intellectualize this. And I think that's another thing that I've done a lot in the past is that like a part would tell me something and my immediate reaction has been, and I did this, a few days ago, this angry part would say something to me and I'd be like, instead of saying, like trying to really listen and understand, I would almost turn away from the part and say like, hey, do I think this is true, what this part is telling me? And well, here's how I could see it from like this other person's point of view. This part was angry about something with one of my relationships, and immediately it was like, oh, do I think this is true? And well, let's see it from the other person's point of view, which I think is just a habit ingrained in me, is to see, to almost like value others' perceptions, even their imagined perceptions, more than my own or more than that of my parts, which was probably really frustrating for that angry part. But we managed to get through stuff. But I think that's probably why this angry part was so insistent and so loud. It was like, you never listen to me. This feels like my one chance to get a message across. And I think it's also possible that like what it wanted was maybe not what it actually wants in the long run. It might have just been like, in this moment, I'm so frustrated that I feel like, I need these big promises because I need to hold you to something because I don't feel like I have any power here. Which, it's very challenging to feel powerless and frustrated. So I feel for that part. I understand that. And I think what's coming up for me now as well is like the idea of consistency with all this, because especially for me with my parts, I feel like they really value being seen and heard. And maybe they're more willing to accept like a slower pace of change or action, but they do want to be checked in with very frequently. I think ideally for me, I check in at the beginning of the day and at the end of the day. And maybe my end of day meditation session's a little shorter, but I definitely feel like it should be an hour in the morning. And I think that, any other time I can spend like walking meditation, being mindful as I stretch and work out, I think those are all really helpful. But I think the consistency is really important because then there's a sense of, Kelly Boyce was talking about the sense of self-trust that comes up. And that means that your parts, when they show up, they feel like they are genuinely welcomed. They feel like they can come to you. They feel like you're actively trying to listen to them. It's like this internal environment of them genuinely feeling like they have a lot of lived experience where they have been listened to, they have been understood, they've been respected, they've been supported, they've been loved. If they have legitimate actions that they would like to see done, let's take away the word legitimate. They have actions they'd like to see done. Often parts want different things, so you can't promise your parts that, hey, I'm going to do everything you ask, but you can promise them that I will consider everything that you ask me seriously. And with the utmost care and compassion. So as I say this, I can feel my parts quieting down and feeling like they've been listened to and understood. And I also think these videos, whether I'm doing guided meditations or creating these, will be very helpful because it's helping me to kind of piece through everything that I'm going through and create a narrative which is very powerful. So this is great.